Let me go, Father. Please, I can't do this anymore.
Go where? My child? There's nowhere for you to run.
I should have never gone to him. I should have never trusted him. What was I thinking? Walking into that office, believing he could help me, believing he cared. I was so naive, so desperate for someone to listen, someone to tell me it would be okay. And he did. At first, he smiled, spoke gently, made me feel safe. But it was all a lie, a cruel, wicked lie. How could I have been so blind? How did I not see the danger? I walked right into his trap, believing in his words, believing in the man who wore God's robe but carried the devil in his heart. And now, what do I have left? Shame? Pain? The pieces of the girl I used to be? I wish I could go back. I wish I had never knocked on that door. I wish I had never met him. The courtroom was silent, suffocating in its stillness. The judge's voice echoed as he read the verdict. Guilty. A wave of gasps filled the room. Some cried in relief, others in disbelief. Adaora sat frozen, her hands gripping the arms of the wooden bench. The words should have brought her peace, but all she felt was an emptiness she couldn't name. Father Damien stood motionless. His face remained eerily calm, but his eyes, those eyes that once made her feel safe, now burned with something else. Hatred. As the guards moved to take him away, he turned slightly toward her. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. A warning. A promise. "This isn't over," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Adaora's breath caught in her throat. Mama Ada was seated a few rows away. For the first time in months, their eyes met. Her mother's face was a mixture of shame and sorrow, as if she had finally begun to understand what she had done to her daughter. But it was too late. Adaora didn't stay for the rest of the proceedings. As soon as the judge's gavel hit the desk, she slipped out of the courtroom, past the reporters, past the whispers, past the judgmental stares. Outside, the world felt both too loud and too distant. She walked blindly through the streets, her mind buzzing with the voices of people who still didn't believe her. She's lying. A man of God wouldn't do such a thing. She seduced him. This will destroy the church. Even after the truth had been proven, some refused to see it. She reached the small one-room space she had been staying in since her mother cast her out. The air inside was stale, the bed unmade, clothes scattered, a reminder that her life had been thrown into chaos and had yet to find order again. She collapsed onto the bed, her body shaking with silent sobs. She had fought so hard for this moment, and yet, why did victory feel so hollow? Days passed, but the world didn't let her forget. People she had known all her life refused to meet her gaze in the market. Some openly crossed the street when they saw her coming. The church that once welcomed her with open arms now ignored her existence. Mama Ada's shop was vandalized one night, the words "Liar's Daughter" scrawled across the wooden door in red paint. When Adaora tried to help clean it, her mother looked at her with tears in her eyes. "This is what you've brought upon us," Mama Ada whispered, her voice heavy with something deeper than anger. Guilt. Adaora didn't respond. What was there to say? Truth had a price, and she was still paying for it. Adaora first noticed the feeling a week after the verdict. It wasn't something she could explain at first, just an uneasiness, a constant pressure at the back of her mind, like someone was watching her. At first, she told herself she was being paranoid. She had been through too much, seen too much. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But then, the letters started coming. They weren't long, just a few words scrawled onto rough sheets of paper. "You will regret what you did. You think this is over? God will punish you for lying." The first time she found one, it was tucked beneath her door. The second, it was thrown through her window in the middle of the night, landing near her bed. She had barely been able to breathe when she picked it up. The worst part? Whoever sent them knew where she lived. She tried to tell herself they were just empty threats, cowards hiding behind words. But deep down, she knew better. The people who had worshipped Father Damien, who had defended him until the very last moment, would not let this go so easily. One evening, as she walked home from the small bakery where she had found work, the feeling returned, stronger this time. The hairs on the back of her neck rose as she quickened her pace. The sun had long set, and the streets were nearly empty. She could hear footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. She turned a corner, then another, hoping, praying that she was imagining it. But the footsteps followed. Adaora's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The street was dark, shadows stretching across the walls of the small shops. But in the distance, she could see a figure standing beneath a flickering street lamp. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching her. Fear curled inside her chest like a living thing, squeezing her lungs. She didn't wait. She turned and ran, not stopping until she was inside her tiny room, the door locked behind her. She pressed her back against it, her breaths coming in short gasps. She wanted to believe she was safe, but the shaking in her hands told her otherwise. The next day, Mama Ada's shop was attacked again. This time, someone had smashed the windows, leaving shards of glass scattered across the floor. On the wooden counter, a piece of paper had been left behind. "Tell your daughter to leave, or next time it will be worse." Mama Ada didn't say a word when Adaora arrived to help, but when their eyes met, Adaora saw it. Fear, not just for herself, for her. For the first time since this nightmare began, Adaora saw a crack in her mother's anger, a silent admission that maybe, just maybe, she had put her faith in the wrong person. Adaora had never felt more alone. The threats had not stopped. If anything, they were getting worse. The whispers followed her everywhere she went, and the looks of disgust and judgment had only grown sharper. Her mother barely spoke to her, torn between fear and guilt, and the town felt smaller with each passing day. She wondered if she had made a mistake, if fighting back had been worth it. One evening, as she sat outside her tiny room, staring at the dark sky, she heard a soft knock on the door. Her body tensed. Lately, knocks had only brought more pain, more reminders that she was unwanted. She opened the door cautiously, half expecting another threat. Instead, Mama Ejima stood there, a quiet strength in her old, tired eyes. "Come with me," she said simply. Adaora hesitated, but something in the woman's voice told her she could trust her. Without a word, she followed. Mama Ejima led her through the winding streets to a small house on the edge of town. Inside, a group of women sat on wooden stools, their faces shadowed by the dim light of a lantern. As soon as Adaora stepped in, the whispers stopped. Every eye turned to her. For a moment, she wanted to run. Then one of the women, a younger girl with a scar running down her cheek, spoke. "You're the girl who spoke out," she said softly. There was no accusation in her voice, only understanding. Adaora nodded, unsure of what to say. One by one, the women shared their own stories, stories of pain, of betrayal, of being silenced by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Some had been hurt by men in the church, others by family members, by teachers, by men who walked freely while their victims lived in shame. Adaora listened, her heart breaking with every word. She was not alone. Mama Ejima placed a hand on her shoulder. "Your voice is powerful, Adaora. And now, it is not just yours, it is ours." For the first time in months, Adaora felt something other than fear. She felt hope. The church had always been a place of refuge, a place where Adaora once found peace. But today, as she stood in front of it, looking at the towering building that had turned its back on her, she felt nothing but cold resolve. A small crowd had gathered. Some faces were familiar, neighbours, old friends, even former classmates. Others were strangers drawn in by the rumors, the scandal that refused to die. Adaora's heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. What if they didn't believe her? What if they attacked her? Then she saw them, the women from Mama Ejima's house, standing together at the back, silent, watching, supporting. She took a breath, stepping forward, stepping into the light. "You all know me," she began, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "I was the girl who used to kneel in this very church, who believed in the words spoken here. I believed in Father Damien. I believed in all of you." She scanned the crowd, locking eyes with some of the people who had called her a liar, who had whispered about her behind her back. And yet, when I spoke the truth, when I begged to be heard, you chose him over me. You chose silence over justice. A ripple of discomfort moved through the gathering. Some shifted uncomfortably, others stared at her with defiance. "Do you know how many times I wanted to give up? How many nights I lay awake, wondering if it would have been better if I had never spoken? If I had never fought?" Her voice wavered, but she refused to let it break. "But I did speak. And because of that, he can never hurt another girl again." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded, some looked away in shame. How many others are suffering in silence? How many of you have been hurt by men who walk these streets freely? Adaora's eyes burned with unshed tears. "I will not be silent. I will not let you forget. And if you won't listen to me, then listen to them." She turned, and from the shadows, the women stepped forward. One by one, they stood beside her, their presence louder than any words. The weight of truth was heavy, but she was no longer carrying it alone. The night was quiet, too quiet. Adaora had grown used to the whispers, the stares, the threats scribbled on scraps of paper. But something about tonight felt different, darker. She had just finished work at the bakery. The streets were nearly empty as she walked home, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the worn cobblestone. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against her chest like a warning. Then she heard it. Another set of footsteps. She quickened her pace, telling herself it was nothing. Just another passerby, just her imagination. Then the steps grew faster. Panic surged through her veins. She turned a corner sharply, only to collide with a wall of muscle. A rough hand clamped over her mouth, muffling the scream that tried to escape her throat. Fear, raw and blinding, took hold of her. "You thought you could ruin everything and walk away?" A voice hissed in her ear. The scent of sweat and alcohol burned her nose. She thrashed, trying to break free, but the grip on her was iron tight. She knew that voice. A church elder, one of Father Damien's most devoted followers. He shoved her against the wall of a narrow alley, pressing his weight against her. "You should have kept your mouth shut," he spat, his fingers digging into her skin. "You don't understand what you've done. You think you're brave? You're nothing, just a stupid girl who doesn't know her place." Adaora's pulse roared in her ears. She struggled harder, rage and terror fighting for space inside her. Number she had fought too hard, lost too much. She would not let them break her again. Gathering every ounce of strength left in her, she bit down hard on his hand. He cursed, jerking away, and in that split second she kicked him with everything she had. He stumbled back, howling in pain. Adaora turned to run, but another figure stepped out of the shadows. Mama Ejima. She stood there gripping a thick wooden staff, and in her eyes there was no fear. "Touch that girl again," she said, her voice sharp as a blade, "and I will make sure you never touch anyone again." The elder hesitated, his face twisted in fury. But something about Mama Ejima, her stance, her unwavering stare, made him take a step back. "This isn't over," he snarled before disappearing into the night. Adaora collapsed, her body shaking violently. Mama Ejima knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her. "It's okay, child. You're safe." But Adaora knew the truth. She was far from safe. Adaora sat in Mama Ejima's small house, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea she wasn't drinking. Her body still ached from the attack, but the real pain was deeper, lodged in her chest, in the pit of her stomach. The fear wasn't just for herself anymore. It was for every girl who had ever been silenced. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was younger than she expected, with tired eyes and a notebook tucked under his arm. The journalist, the one who had been quietly following her story. "I found something," he said, taking a seat across from her. "Something you need to hear." Adaora's fingers tightened around the cup. She wasn't sure she could take more bad news. The journalist took a breath, his voice low. Father Damien wasn't the only one. Her stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" He slid a stack of papers toward her. Documents, testimonies, old records. There have been other cases, other girls. Some as young as 12. And not just in this town. He pointed to a page. There's a pattern. Priests accused, the church covering it up, moving them to different parishes instead of holding them accountable. Damien was just one of many. Adaora's hands shook as she flipped through the pages. Different names, different faces, same story. "No," she whispered, bile rising in her throat. "No, this can't be real." The journalist's jaw tightened. "It's real, and it's worse than you think. Some of these girls tried to speak out, and they disappeared." Adaora's breath hitched. Disappeared? Sent away, silenced, or worse? His voice turned grim. One of them was found dead years later, ruled a suicide. But her family never believed it. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter, the air too thick. "They knew," Adaora murmured. "The church knew, and they let it happen." Mama Ejima, who had been silent all this time, reached out and placed a hand over Adaora's. "And now, child, you know the truth. The question is, what will you do with it?" Adaora looked up, fire burning in her chest. She had thought her fight was over. She had been wrong. Adaora stood outside the church, staring up at the place that had once felt like home. The same church where she had prayed as a child, where she had believed in kindness, in faith, in goodness. Now all she saw was a fortress of silence, of secrets, of buried sins. She wasn't alone this time. Behind her stood the women from Mama Ejima's house, the journalist, and a handful of others who had finally dared to listen. Survivors, witnesses, people who had seen too much and stayed quiet for too long. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and a priest stepped out. Not Father Damien, he was gone now, but another man cut from the same cloth. The same robes, the same gentle, deceptive smile. "Adaora," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "You should not be here. This is a house of God." Her hands curled into fists. God's house should not protect monsters. A murmur rippled through the people behind her. The priest's smile faltered for a second before returning, forced and tight. "I understand that you are hurting, but spreading falsehoods..." Falsehoods? The word came out like fire. How many other girls suffered before me? How many before them? How many were silenced? His expression hardened. "You need to leave." "No," Adaora said, louder this time. The anger inside her, anger she had buried for too long, finally broke free. "You turned your back on me when I needed you most. You called me a liar. You protected the man who hurt me, and now you want me to leave? No." Her voice shook, but not with fear, with rage. "I will not be silent anymore. You can ignore me. You can pretend this never happened, but we are not going away. Not this time." More people had started gathering, some church members, some curious onlookers. Whispers spread through the crowd. The priest's face darkened. "This is not the place for this." Adaora let out a bitter laugh. "Then where is the place? In the shadows, in locked rooms where victims cry and no one listens." A voice from the crowd broke the tension. "She's right." Heads turned. An older woman stepped forward, her face lined with pain. "I knew a girl once. She was like Adaora. She tried to speak, and they sent her away. Her voice cracked. She never came back. The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon ever preached here. The priest stepped back, as if the weight of their truth was something he couldn't bear. He looked at the crowd, then at Adaora, then at the growing number of women stepping forward. For the first time, he had no words. Adaora took a deep breath. She had come for justice, and she wasn't leaving without it. Adaora stood at the doorway of her mother's house, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. It had been months since she had stepped inside, since her mother had cast her out, choosing shame over truth. But now there was nowhere left to hide. She knocked once, no answer. Again. Finally, the door creaked open, and there she was, Mama Ada, looking smaller than Adaora remembered, tired, older. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable before she stepped aside, letting Adaora in. The air inside was thick, heavy with unspoken words. "You shouldn't be here," Mama Ada said, her voice strained. Adaora's chest ached, but she forced herself to speak. "I needed to come." Her mother sat down, staring at her hands. "I know what you want me to say," she murmured. I don't know how." Adaora swallowed hard. "You don't know how to say you're sorry." Mama Ada flinched. "It's not that simple." "It is." Adaora's voice cracked. "You were supposed to protect me, Mama. You turned your back on me. And for what? A man who destroyed lives? A church that only cared about its reputation?" Tears welled in Mama Ada's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I was scared." Her voice was barely a whisper. "You don't understand what it means to have the whole world turn against you, to have people look at you like you're cursed. I thought, maybe if I ignored it, it would go away." Adaora let out a bitter laugh. "Did it? Did it go away, Mama?" Her mother shook her head, guilt carving deep lines into her face. "No," she whispered. "It only got worse." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then Mama Ada finally looked up, her eyes full of pain. "I should have believed you," she admitted. "I should have fought for you." Adaora's throat tightened. She had dreamed of these words, prayed for them. But now that they were here, they didn't erase the hurt. "Is it too late?" her mother asked, voice trembling. Adaora wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell her mother that the damage had been done, that nothing could ever be the same. Instead, she whispered, "I don't know." Mama Ada reached for her hand, hesitant, afraid. This time, Adaora didn't pull away. The wind felt different against Adaora's skin that morning, lighter, as if the air itself had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. She stood outside Mama Ejima's house, watching the sun rise over the town that had once been her prison. Now it was something else. Not home, not yet, but not a cage either. Mama Ejima walked up beside her, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You look like a girl with a decision to make," she said softly. Adaora exhaled. "I don't know what comes next." "You don't have to. Not yet." For the first time in a long time, Adaora believed that. The town was still talking, the church was still divided. Some people still looked at her with hatred, others with pity, but more and more, she saw something different. Respect, courage, a quiet growing strength. The other women were speaking out now. Some had even gone to the authorities. The fear was still there, but so was the fire. Mama Ada had tried to see her again, had held her hands and promised to do better. Adaora wasn't sure if trust could be rebuilt, but she knew this. She was no longer waiting for her mother's love to heal her. She was healing herself. As she picked up her small bag, the journalist approached, a cautious smile on his face. "There's a place in the city," he said. "A shelter for survivors. They need someone like you, someone brave." Adaora looked at Mama Ejima, at the town behind her, then at the road ahead. She smiled. "I think I'm ready." And this time, she truly was. Adaora walked away from the only life she had ever known, but not in defeat, She was not running. She was not broken. She was choosing herself. The city loomed in the distance, full of possibilities, full of unknowns. But this time, fear did not control her. She had already faced the worst of it and survived. The women she left behind were still fighting. Some had come forward to tell their stories. Some were still gathering the courage. The church was struggling under the weight of its secrets, and though many still tried to defend it, the truth was no longer hidden. The silence had been shattered. Father Damien was gone, but Adaora knew there were more like him. More men who thrived in the shadows. More institutions willing to protect them. But she also knew this. They would not win forever. Not while she still had a voice. As the bus rumbled forward, taking her toward a new life, she looked out the window, her reflection staring back at her. She was no longer the girl who had once begged to be believed. She was the woman who had forced the world to listen. And she was just getting started.